Hello, podcast listeners. I'm your host, Jacko Zwetsloot. Today it is Tuesday, June 28th, 2022. And joining me here in the studio is retired Republic of Korea Army Major and now Professor Dongyoun to talk about several aspects of South Korea's military defense. But first, let me remind you all listeners, please leave a review about this podcast on iTunes or whatever platform you use. And be sure to share this podcast episode with colleagues and friends and even enemies and people you don't know. On Spotify, you can leave a rating but no reviews, but please do that anyway. And if you're listening to this on YouTube, please click like and subscribe. Secondly, check out NK News and consider buying a subscription. It's more affordable than you think. In fact, if you sign up for the annual plan, it's less than $1 a day, and that helps to fund the excellent journalism that my colleagues put out every day. Thirdly, follow nknews.org and myself on Twitter. All right, so to introduce my guest today properly, Professor Dongyoun is a retired major of the ROK Army and is now assistant professor in the Department of Military Studies at Seokyeong University in Seoul, as well as the director of the Center for Future Defense Technology and Entrepreneurship. Welcome on the show, Professor Jo.
Thank you very much for having me.
You have quite a lot of interest and research areas as well as experience. So I thought we could talk about a few of them today. First of all, tell us a little bit about your experience of being a woman field grade officer in the ROK Army, which has a reputation for being a very male-dominated culture. How was that for you?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for having me again. So regarding your first question, definitely had been not easy. It was quite challenging. I think many of the women in uniform, not only in South Korea but also abroad, definitely can understand the situation, but it's getting better, I think, in comparison with the 20 years ago when I just started my career at the Korean Military Academy in 2000. So it's getting better, and I hope it would be better for my juniors. So I was the intelligence officer in the Republic of Korean Army, and then after promotion to the lieutenant colonel, no, captain and major, I just moved to the policy and strategy unit. So I had an opportunity to see how the defense security policy and the military strategy has been developed. And it was really helpful for me to study for now in the academia. So it was quite a meaningful experience for me.
So you started off your military career in the intelligence section of the Army. Tell us a little bit about that. How do we know what we know about North Korea's Army?
So regarding the intelligence, not only in South Korea, but also the United States and abroad, there are several sources we can get together information and analyze it. So in order to acquire quantitative intelligence from that. So I was in Signal Intelligence Unit.
And that's listening to North Korean radio and communications.
Yeah, mostly, yes, you are correct. So signal intelligence is not only the signal, but also all kinds of communication on the internet. So it's quite a lot of information we have to analyze. So there are many analysts to look at 24/7 days. And then we just try to get together all the information, not only signal, but also the image and also the human resources, so that we just try to get a big picture, not only the pieces of information. So we try to understand what the DPRK really wants, not only at strategic level, but tactical level as well. So it is basically the starting point of the developing operations in the military.
Now, North Korea, you mentioned there on the internet, North Korea has a number of websites. Some of them are targeting South Korean people. Some of them target an international audience. Some of them are in Chinese for Chinese audiences.
Right.
Are those messages quite different across the different, the different target audiences? Do they shape a very different message for each of those audiences?
I think you can imagine, and you already mentioned a little bit about it. So the country like North Korea or China, they send very strong message to the very targeted audience. So they just try to tailor all the information and the message to each target audience. So of course, for example, to South Koreans, they just try to, North Korea just try to, how can I say, look like a very advanced economy or the civil society or market economy, so that they can, in the end, if we have a negotiation, then they just wanted to have upper hand. The effectiveness, I don't know, but some cases, some young generations in South Korea, they just love to see and look at that media, for example, on YouTube, and then they have very different thoughts in comparison with the older generations who have experienced in Korean War. So,
and there's also the website 우리 민족끼리, which targets South Korean people. I think it's blocked in South Korea, but South Korean people who use a VPN can look at it.
I think so, yes.
And you think that some young people might be interested in that kind of thing?
Yeah, of course.
Do you think it's more interesting because it's banned, because it's blocked by the South Koreans? Like if it was open, if South Koreans could look at North Korean propaganda easily, do you think then it would lose some of its magical attraction?
I think so. Some part of maybe misinformation, disinformation is quite a top agenda in the United States these days. And it is not only North Korea, but also many countries in Eastern Europe and eastern part of the other countries. They use this media to kind of attract the young generations to understand their culture, their aim and objectives. So it's quite effective. In some way, you mentioned, that way also attracts, I think, young generations in a way.
I've seen some of their YouTube videos, and the ones that are produced in English, and I have to say that they're actually generally quite boring. They don't seem very attractive to me.
Really?
I can't imagine many young people being attracted to that. Yeah.
I see. Maybe, but it's a very strange, kind of very different culture, right? So you are sometimes attracted by the opposite kind of characteristics of the media. So I'm not sure, but I think so.
And going back to SIGINT, there are some, or were maybe in the past, there were some North Korean radio stations that would transmit lists of numbers, long numbers. We call them the numbers radio station. Did you ever look into that and listen to that and analyze those numbers?
I was not directly responsible for analyzing that numbers, but some of my colleagues are, and I think were working on that. And it really takes a lot of time because regarding the signal intelligence, analyzing is a really important task, but the other one is the sources. How to identify sources from the DPRK is more important than the analyzing the numbers itself.
Oh.
So if we just, those kind of activities go public, then DPRK change the sources. So it's quite challenging for all the SIGINT analysts to continue the analyzing the numbers without publicizing or letting the public knowing the activities itself. So
you mean that if the South Korean military is able to understand what those messages are from the numbers, then the South Korean military will not be telling people that it understands those messages?
Sometimes it needs to be kind of a secret because we just want to focus that sources from the DPRK. But once the DPRK understands, South Korean analysts understand what we are doing, then they just try to change the signal sources. So it's really challenging. And these days, what's worse? So if we just use this kind of cell phone, it is rather easy, not very difficult to intercept the signal in the air. But if they...
So is that the voice-to-voice communication, or are we talking about data being sent to and from a mobile phone?
Data in general.
Okay.
But if we... maybe DPRK use these kind of underground cables, then that's really difficult.
Here in South Korea?
Here in South Korea, also in North Korea, in the DPRK.
Okay, so hang on. So what were you saying about the cables? If North Korea uses underground cables,
if they are upfront to the area, then it's really challenging for the South Korean activists, analysts to intercept that signal.
Right. So underground cables are a safer way of transmitting information than a cell phone or radio.
Yeah,
okay.
not only in Cold War era, the Soviet Union tried to cut the underwater cable to communicate from the Western countries, right? So that's still have effects.
Okay, so let's get into some basic questions. Do you think that a North Korean military attack, full scale or small scale, on South Korea is likely in the next 5 years?
Very challenging question.
Yeah.
So your question is quite broad, right?
It's very broad. You can interpret that how you like it. Yeah.
So if we are talking about the full-scale war on the Korean Peninsula, the possibility could be very slim because it's not only the two Korea's problem, but also it's a Northeast Asia national security issues, but also the international. And in midst to the U.S. Really has been focused on the Asia Pacific region. So I think not only me, but also many other experts see the full-scale war, maybe attacked by North Korea, could be really difficult and challenging. But provocations, small-scale provocations.
Like Yeonpyeongdo, like the Cheonan.
Right. Those kind of a kinetic provocation can be happened, but also non-kinetic provocation can be happened. And it's also still, I think, now happening. For example, cyber activities has been going on. So it is not only the military provocation, but also really affected the society as a whole.
Yep. And we'll come back to cyber later on. Is the ROK military, from what you saw when you were there for 20 years, ready to fight to defend South Korea from any invasion or act of aggression by North Korea?
Yes, for sure. But these days, it's quite challenging for South Korean military to protect national security, peace, and security on the Korean Peninsula, because it's not only the problem of military provocation, but also it's all sources provocation can be happened. And it's not only the matter of South Korean military capabilities to protect the country, but also international cooperation should be more strengthened based on the ROK and U.S. alliance. So those areas should be more improved. And I think the ROK military has been making a lot of efforts on those fronts.
You mentioned international cooperation. What about cooperation with Japan?
For me, as an intelligence officer, intelligence sharing with Japan is imperative because it's not, how can I say? So South Korea is not part of the Five Eyes yet, but South Korea is working with Five Eyes countries as well. But on the Korean Peninsula, Japan has a lot of intelligence capabilities. They have U.S. forces in Japan. And if contingency happen on the Korean Peninsula, we have to work with Japan as well. So historical legacy is a setting aside, but we need to work together. And I think some progress has been made in this administration already, in NATO as well, for now. So I think I hope we have a more strengthened trilateral cooperation on this front.
During your time in the Army, you worked a lot with the U.S. alliance partners. You had a lot to do with alliance issues. How is the U.S. ROK alliance?
So far, so good, I think. But as I mentioned already, for now, the United States military is trying to strengthen, adapt commercial state-of-art capabilities and technologies against some adversaries. So on that front, South Korea has a lot of work to do with the U.S. But that front is not only military aspect, but also quite economic and then commercial sector involved. So it's quite new cooperation we have to deal with. So right after the ROK and U.S. summit, two leaders from the U.S. and South Korea agreed to work on this cooperating on new emerging technology. So I think it's just beginning phase of cooperation.
And that's related to your new role at the Center for Future Defense Technology and Entrepreneurship, right?
I know it's quite long.
It's a long title,
but
yes.
I hope. Me, I'm just new in the academia, and then I just retired as major.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe if I know the direction should be go forward in that direction, but it's not enough for me by myself to do all the work. So I really want to help the Iraq military and the U.S. forces to go forward in that direction, if I can.
And how much does the ROK-US alliance change in accordance with political changes in South Korea or in the United States?
So ROK and U.S. alliance has a long history. So it's not going to change a lot depending on the administration or political leadership change. But in South Korea, for now, the more conservative administration came to office. So I think this ROK and U.S. alliance officially, and I hope substantially, will be strengthened more. But I hope the direction to strengthen the alliance should be more kind of advanced against the new challenges rather than old-fashioned way of thinking.
You were still in the army when U.S. President Donald Trump threatened to maybe pull out all the U.S. forces from Korea. Tell us how you felt at that time. Were you worried that might actually happen?
So when I was in the Ministry of National Defense and the Republic of Korean Army, I had a chance to work at the Department of Foreign Affairs as well. So, State Department in the U.S. and DOD in the U.S. has really different view on this issue. And also the president back then had a lot of different issues as well. So just narrowing down the military aspect, ROK and U.S. military officers, we talked a lot these issues as well. But in the end, how can I say, on the field level, we just try to more strengthen our cooperation despite the political kind of a change has happening. But still, I think that triggers more military officers from the two countries more work together better. So I hope for the best in the foreseeable future as well.
Now, before this interview, to help me prepare, you shared with me your resume, and I looked through that, and I saw there that several years ago you wrote a master's thesis at Seokyeong University on the topic of peace operations in North Korea, lessons learned from U.S. operations in Iraq and Somalia. That sounds like a very interesting title. Can you give us a little summary of what lessons were learned from U.S. operations in Iraq and Somalia that might be useful for future peace operations in North Korea?
So frankly speaking, I was a master's student. So I just tried to develop more comprehensive strategy to deal with the North Korean issues. So from back then, from my thinking, the DPRK issue is not only the military issue, but also humanitarian and economic issue as well. So basically, I just asserted in my thesis, South Korea and the international society has to develop two-front strategy, so-called. One, we have to stand against the North Korean military and the leadership, but also as well, we just try to deal with the humanitarian and economic issues more cooperative way. So that's quite humble thinking back then.
But that's kind of what the U.S. tried to do in Somalia in the early 1990s, isn't it? It was a humanitarian effort rather than a military effort, unlike Iraq.
Right. So military front, I just tried to draw some lessons from the Iraq case and the humanitarian and economic issues from the Somalia case. So still, I'm working on that topic. Yeah, we'll see.
What kind of peace operations do you imagine would be possible in North Korea, and when? In what circumstances?
So I think for now we can look at the Ukraine. So I think 2 days ago I read a newspaper that the Ukraine president now try to turn to more how can I say, reconstructive operations rather than the assertive operations against Russia. So I think that kind of transition can be thought in DPRK case as well in the future if something happens on the Korean Peninsula.
Do you mean some kind of regime change?
It depends. Maybe regime change from the inner side of the DPRK can be happen anytime. But if provocation trigger some more, not full-scale war, but more kind of a trigger wide, how can I say, consequences on the Korean Peninsula, then maybe we have to think those kind of steps we have to prepare. So, yeah, I know it's quite vague, but...
And you said that would be peace operations involving the international community, involving
Definitely.
different countries?
Definitely, yes.
One very sensitive issue, when people talk about any kind of peace operations on the Korean Peninsula involving multiple countries, the question always arises, well, what about Japanese?
Right.
Could they be involved in future peace operations on the Korean Peninsula?
So maybe feet on the ground from the Japan could be challenging for now. We haven't never really have a deep conversation with Japan on this issue. But peace operation itself need international assistance and cooperation definitely. So whatever kind of assistance or support from Japan, I think should be made if some events happened on the Korean Peninsula.
I also saw in your resume that in 2017 you lectured the Battle Command Training Program Group of the Opposing Forces Command, Daejeon, on North Korea's military strategy and tactics. Could you tell us about that experience?
So it's basically the trained ROC units. So we just moved to the every unit in South Korea, and then we have, according to the operational plan, we just examine the unit's readiness to execute that planned operation. So for me, I was responsible for, how can I say, acting like the DPRK.
Right. That's when I saw Opposing Forces Command, I thought that's exactly what that means.
Yeah,
so
it
it's like a war game.
It
You're
is.
pretending to be North Korea.
Right.
Was that fun? Was that challenging? How did you do that? What did you have to do?
So I had been trained as an intelligence officer. So what I have learned from the basic school and the advanced school in the military, how to think like DPRK military. So
Did you have to dress up in the uniform?
no, not
Did you have
really.
to speak with a North Korean accent?
No, not that kind of, but of a strategy and tactics, I mean. So I just try to respond to the ROC units and see how they prepare for that the North Korean military action, and then so that we just try to gauge their preparedness.
I think our listeners might find it interesting if you can share some overall ideas about North Korean tactics. What makes North Korean tactics North Korean? What are their defining characteristics?
Oh, so tactics. So it's depending on what kind of branches you are looking at. So it's quite really specific war game, so to speak.
Let's start with the land army then.
So, for example, if you look at the upfront artillery units, then you're responding to the certain ROC units' movement, and then they just have certain rules to move. So those kind of really detailed simulation should be made on the computer program. So I was behind the computer. So rather than I just wear the uniform. So I just try to command all the NK military units under my command. So we just try to have a war game on the computer screen.
And did you win any battles?
Sometimes I lose, sometimes I win. So
after that experience, did you feel more or less hopeful about South Korea's ability to defend itself?
As I mentioned, I really have a firm, confidence in the ROC forces' capabilities to deal with North Korea. But as I mentioned, with all kind of different types of threats emerging these days. So as I mentioned, maybe we can have a more conversation on the new emerging threats. So cyber is one example of new emerging threats. Also, space has been really a prominent issue for not only South Korea, but also abroad. And number 3, hypersonic missiles capabilities should be noted these days. So these are the kind of technologies we have to look at, because at any moment, at any time, these technologies can be transformed to the military capabilities, and then DPRK is not exception. So they have also many technologies and the experiences.
Yeah, let's talk a little bit about North Korea's cyber strategy. Recently on this podcast, I interviewed Jeff White from the BBC Lazarus Heist podcast, and so he talked a lot about North Korea's cybercrime, North Korea's stealing cryptocurrency, the $1 billion from the Bank of Bangladesh, and other kinds of cybercrimes. Can you tell us a bit about North Korea's cyber strategy in military terms rather than simple criminal terms?
So the overall DPRK's strategy is to pursue asymmetrical strategy against South Korea and U.S.
What does asymmetric mean for our listeners who may not be familiar with that word?
So for example, ROK and U.S. alliance has tremendous conventional military capabilities in comparison with the DPRK. So if DPRK pursue full-scale conventional war on the Korean Peninsula, the possibility to win could be very slim. So DPRK very wisely understand that gap between the ROK and U.S. alliance and the DPRK. So DPRK try to pursue so-called asymmetrical military capabilities so that they can have a more unconventional military capabilities to cope with the ROK and U.S. alliance. For example, cyber is one of the best examples they just try to develop. And the missile capabilities, and these days space and hypersonic capabilities are some examples. So for example, the you mentioned cyber capabilities. I cannot remember the exact year, but the DPRK aims to develop the cyber strategy as well as the, educate really young students, brilliant students, to have better understand on this cyber tactics, strategy, and all the knowledge. So these are the beginning for the DPRK. They just try to improve cyber capabilities. And these days, these cyber capabilities have a kind of, really influence not only the military front, but also, as you mentioned, economic and societal front as well.
So what can they do? Can they, for example, turn off a South Korean power station?
Some attempts have been already on the public, so we can see some examples. But I think many people vividly remember the Sony hacking. I think that was really kind of a beginning or starting point when many international communities recognized the DPRK's cyber capabilities. And I was back then working with the NSA. Of course, the NSA was responsible for analyzing what's the behind that accident, that event. But when we just talking about cyber capabilities, just people just imagine really brilliant, very unthinkable skills or tactics, but it's not that as always. Like, for example, Sony hacking, someone just send really, just good titled email to inside employees, and then he or she just happened to open the email. So those kind of human kind of factor is always matters, and also in the military front in South Korea as well.
Yes, I should jump in there and say that this morning on NK News we published a story about a South Korean-based hacking organization that conducted a spear phishing campaign against me earlier this year, and they sent me an email with a link in it, which I did not click on, but I sent it to our cybersecurity expert Niels, who has been looking at it with Kaspersky, and they found that it was designed to take control of my computer remotely, and it was not a North Korean organization, but a South Korea-based organization.
Right. Also, if you just track the sources who just try to attempt to attack you, probably it's not based in DPRK, maybe somewhere else, maybe Southeastern Asia countries, maybe in South Korea. So those kind of really difficult to trace back the resources. It is really delicate kind of characteristics the cyber capabilities can have. So, still really challenging.
Yes, and also very dangerous. So listeners, if you do get an email from someone you don't recognize, or if you're not sure whether the email address is correct, or in fact, if you get a link or a file, don't open it. Call that person first and say, did you send me a file? That's the best way, isn't it? You would, I think you can learn from other people's mistakes. That's what I do these days, a two-stage verification. Someone sends me a file and I'm not expecting a file, I'll call them and say, hey, did you send me a file?
Very, very wise.
Do you also practice good cyber security on yourself?
Actually, when I was working in the Defense Security Agency, I had a lot of kind of similar emails. So my personal account, I don't know how they just got to know my personal email address, but it's quite open society, especially in South Korea. So it's easy for them to track.
If you want to receive any more emails like that, you can mention your email address right now. Would you like?
No, thank you.
Okay. Now, from 2019 to 2020, you worked at the Korea Army Research Center developing Army Vision 2050. What is that? What's the Army Vision 2050?
I know it sounds really big, but so as I mentioned, to deal with the emerging new kind of threats,
like cyber,
the Republic of Korean Army, where I belonged at that time, tried to envision after 30 years. I know it's really unrealistic to predict after 30 years, but that kind of a whole initiative meant to have imagination. What kind of different war will be prevailed on the Korean Peninsula after 10 years, after 20 years? So then what should we do to prepare for that kind of new challenges and new threats? So the center focuses on new emerging technologies and how to work with the commercial sector. For example, startups, maybe companies, which has really advanced technologies in comparison with the government and the military these days. So that's kind of a new kind of initiative. So still.
And that's related to Army Vision 2050.
Right.
You mentioned space industry before, or space militarization. South Korea's moving into space, just launched something recently. Tell us a bit about space militarization and North Korea.
So,
the Korean Peninsula.
Right. Good question. And thank you for bringing that topic as well. So if we look at the space militarization or space weaponization, we can first talk about the U.S.-China competition in space these days. So, for example, SpaceX or Virgin Galactic or many other really new emerging startups in the Silicon Valley in the U.S. really compete with the China's counterparts these days. So these commercial startups, commercial companies have advanced technologies which can be used in the military. But maybe, for example, DARPA in the U.S. Under the DoD has been a kind of pioneer or the leader in research and development new technologies. For example, internet, GPS are the products of the DoD's efforts. But now the whole these R&D efforts has been made in commercial sector. So the U.S. DoD tried to engage with the Silicon Valley.
Yeah.
And then one of the kind of war-fighting areas these technologies can be used is space.
How can we fight war in space? And is that even a good thing?
Right. So maybe you can see some movies. Maybe in the movies they
Star
just
Wars?
do Star Wars. So not like that.
Okay.
So if we have a kind of space competition, if in kind of a military terms, it is rather more like on the ground. So in order to acquire information from the satellites, we need to have a ground control station as well. So these are kind of a data links connected. So these kind of all the infrastructure, not only in space, but also on the ground, should be really connected, well organized, well structured. So these are the kind of a big issue, not only for DoD in the States, but also China and South Korea and other many international partners. So space competition, you can better understand, is quite a really comprehensive term, not only in the space, but on the space as well as, so those kind of new advanced technology combined kind of war can be imagined.
And it sounds like it also includes trying to block your enemy from communicating with their satellite.
Right. So those kind of efforts has been really going on. Also in South Korea, not GPS, we using GPS, but also we are developing KPS, which is very similar to the GPS, but complement the accuracy to have more accurate communication.
Do you know what that stands for? Is that Korea Position Satellite?
Right.
Is it?
Exactly.
Oh, okay.
So that's one of the huge space programs South Korea kind of have invested.
Do hypersonic missiles also fit into this militarization of space? Is that because they leave the atmosphere?
Right. So some of the, I think we talked a little bit during the seminar before, but the some kind of a new characteristics these hypersonic missiles have in comparison with the ballistic and cruise missiles. They have very low altitude as well as really fast. So ground-based radar cannot intercept easily these hypersonic weapons. And some of the really kind of concerns from many experts these days is China has been really advancing these hypersonic capabilities and technologies. But in comparison with these Chinese advanced hypersonic missiles program, the MDA, missile defense from the U.S., is still not sufficient for coping with these hypersonic missiles.
So that we're talking about the THAAD system, for example.
Right.
So THAAD is useless against hypersonic missiles.
It's not against the hypersonic missiles. So we have very structured missile defense systems against ballistic and cruise missiles. But the hypersonic missiles is quite new capabilities, new technologies. So I think the DoD will publish the new missile defense review, I think this year. And I really look forward to what kind of strategy they will adopt. But from my understanding, the U.S. DoD will not gonna establish the missile defense against the hypersonic missiles until 2026.
Oh, that's a few
because
years.
the technological gap. But for South Korean perspective, it is quite challenging because we have extended deterrence, right? Using the U.S. missile defense capabilities, and then from North Korean's capabilities, they haven't yet advanced up to the level to develop the full hypersonic missile capabilities, but they have a potential.
They did test one earlier this year, didn't they?
They claimed, but really, if you look at really technologically deep inside of the program, that's not very sure capabilities yet. But still, we have to prepare for that.
Okay, so China definitely has hypersonic missiles.
Right.
Does the U.S. also have hypersonic missiles?
Definitely, but I think some technological areas the U.S. and China compete these days is quite neck and neck. So the quantum computer, hypersonic missiles, and as well as artificial intelligence and autonomy, those areas are very, how can I say, China and the U.S. compete each other, so we will see.
Are you nervous about artificial intelligence?
In what way?
Well, this is not North Korea related, but if you listen to some people, they see that artificial intelligence especially general artificial intelligence, could be a threat to humanity's existence 10, 20, 30 years from now.
So actually, this kind of topic has been really brought up early this year, I think. So AI community in South Korea always try to make the public understand how far the artificial intelligence can do, for example, for the military operations. And the many AI experts in South Korea admit that the maturity and readiness of this artificial intelligence has not been yet up to the military operations. Do you know what I mean? So it's not still really a lot of gap between the theory of artificial intelligence and the practice of artificial intelligence can be used. But still, artificial intelligence can be used not only the combat purpose operations, but also many logistic operations can be used. So rather than afraid of the artificial intelligence, I just try to look at the potential, how the military can leverage this emerging technologies in not only military operations, but also the other domestic logistical operations in the military.
Do you see any evidence that North Korea is doing research in the area of artificial intelligence or quantum computing?
I haven't read or heard of those news, but as I mentioned, the DPRK improved their cyber capabilities a lot.
Yeah.
So based on the cyber capabilities, they can expand the knowledge base, I think, to work with China, maybe other partners on this front, because basically in order to leverage the artificial intelligence, you need a lot of data based on the really well-organized data set.
Yeah.
Then you can use that data set to command this artificial intelligence do something.
Yeah.
But China is very famous for collecting all the private information, really. So I'm not sure how they cooperate on this front, but I'm a little bit afraid of this cyber capabilities can be used for improving artificial intelligence.
Now, you're also involved in projects on developing the standardization of dual-use unmanned aerial vehicles, or UAVs, or drones. Tell us about drones in North and South Korea. What are they used for, and what do we know about North Korea's drone capability?
So this is the 5-year research project, and I am working with the Seoul National University and KARI on this project. So this is the first year, so I cannot tell the result of the whole project yet. But from my basic research and understanding, the commercial drone market, global drone market, has been dominated by China's private company. More than 70% of the commercial drone market has been dominated Chinese company, so-called DJI. And then you can see some examples in the Ukraine war. Many commercial drones had been used, right?
These are mainly drones with cameras to see what's going on, is that right?
Right. So these are the called ISR, so intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance purpose. But we look at the Ukraine case. These drones can be equipped with the shooting capabilities as well. So they see and shoot at the same time. So it is quite a threat for Russia as well. And it's quite changing some war, how can I say, not paradigm as a whole, but it's some changes, some landscape in war. So from South Korean perspective, so if you look at the South Korean drone market, 70%, more than 70% of South Korea's drone market heavily depended on China, and then U.S. as well. The U.S., I think for now as well, heavily dependent on the Chinese component to make drones. And these are not the exception for the military operations as well. So they just try to fix it. The United States want to fix it. In South Korea, the whole purpose of this research projects is to fix the situation as well. So we just try to...
you mean to use non-Chinese drones?
Non-Chinese drones or non-Chinese components so that we can improve the South Korea's domestic drone market. And also these drones can be used in the military.
So dual-use unmanned aerial vehicles. The dual there is what, military and civilian?
And civilian, right. Yeah,
okay.
Yes.
Now, I remember a few years ago, I think it was when President Moon was president, that there were some drones that came down in South Korea. Maybe they ran out of battery or they crashed or something, but they were from North Korea, and there was an SD card with some photographs of sensitive locations in these drones. Were you still in the military then?
So you mean the North Korea has
North Korea drones.
I think so, because drone is quite cheap but very effective to accomplish ISR missions. So it's quite relatively easy to monitor with the drones. So for example, my children can play with the drones. They can fly these really small commercial drones to look at the neighbors maybe, right? But these are also can be used in the military operations as well, because it is really difficult to detect because it's so small.
Yeah.
And if it's fly with really little noise, then it is really difficult to kind of detect and intercept. So North Korea, definitely part of its asymmetrical strategy, drone can be used, but it's not very advanced technologies equipped with that drone from the DPRK back then, I think.
Let me ask a couple of practical questions. So North Korea sends a drone across the demilitarized zone into South Korea. North Korea wants to get some photographs of the Blue House. How far can a North Korean drone travel in South Korea and still be controlled by a North Korean person on the ground back in North Korea?
Oh, so it's quite technological question. So I have no answer for that. But based on my really basic understanding, so the data link between the drone platform and the ground control system is depending on the battery, also the communication links.
Right.
So if you want to have more advanced kind of ISR capabilities, then you should be larger drone.
A larger drone,
right?
Okay.
For example, like in Ukraine, the drone from Turkey, it's more than 10 kilogram. So it's quite big UAS.
Probably noisy too.
Right. It is very visible, right?
Yeah.
So it's a wartime, then they can be used. But in the peacetime or or maybe just these daily times, then it can be really detectable. And then after that accident, counter drone capabilities has been widely developed. So really important buildings.
Like jamming signals to break the data link.
Right.
Okay.
So it's a kinetic or non-kinetic can be used to counter drone threats. So it's more challenging for the users to use drones.
Okay, so if I had here in South Korea, let's say I go to Namdaemun, I buy a commercial drone, some Chinese commercial drone, and I go up to the demilitarized zone. How far can I fly that thing into North Korea before I lose the data link? 2 kilometers, 10 kilometers?
You are not permitted to fly drones.
Not allowed to. But let's say I was like Pak Sang-hak and I broke the law. Let's say I did that. I go up there and somehow the South Korean military doesn't see me. And so I'm at the very southern edge of the demilitarized zone. I'm inside the civilian control area. And I want to fly this drone to Pyongyang. Can I go to Pyongyang or is that too far?
So based on the what kind of drones you purchased at the first place?
Well, a small, quiet, commercially available.
But we actually had conducted research on the commercial drones, how far it can fly.
Yeah.
But it's really, how can I say, very depending on the drone's battery and as I mentioned, the communication links.
Yep.
So, and then also weather.
Okay. So depending on all these things, is Pyongyang possible?
No, I don't think so.
That'd be too far.
It's
okay. So maybe Kaesong.
So it's a really not simple. I cannot give you a very simple answer to that question. But if we just limit commercial drones, then it is usually less than 100 kilogram, for example.
Sure. In weight?
In weight.
Sure, yeah.
So in weight. And then kind of a maximum weight if less than 100 kilogram. Or usually in the field, we use less than maybe 10 kilogram drones usually at the battalion, up to the battalion level. Then it cannot definitely go up to the Pyongyang with this really small UAS. But if you have a bigger one, then definitely it's a different story.
So that's a non-commercial one. It's something like what the Turkish are making, for example.
Yeah, it is a military, more big drones.
And if I'm not controlling it, are there drones where I can program it? I can say, look, I don't need a data link, just fly to Pyongyang, take some photographs and come back. This is the program. Is that possible? Is that feasible now?
We are developing now. So it's a really good question because it is one of the ways we use autonomous and the artificial intelligence in drones. But we are trying to develop the really fully autonomous vehicles.
So you don't need a controller, you don't need a data link.
Yeah, but we have to input some information and then fly.
A flight path.
But the technological readiness, we just call it TRL. It's not up to, from my really basic understanding, maybe up to 7. But if you use 7 is so if you want to use in the military, we need more 8 to 9 TRLs level.
10 is maximum?
10 is maximum, so 1 to 10. Then so it's not fully mature, the technologies, because it's really, if you want to use for the military operations, it should have assured not only readiness, but also the, how can I say, trustness and safety should be tested. But we haven't been fully tested that capabilities in that purpose, right? But still going on.
I'm guessing that the weakness or the drawback of an autonomous drone is that if you're sending a drone to, let's say, for example, to Pyongyang to take some photographs or some film footage, the drone cannot send that footage back here. It has to fly back with a memory card. Is that, am I understanding that correctly?
But we already have ISR capabilities, so we do not use really small UAS for the purpose, but we have already a really global Hawk or the full-scale RSR capabilities deployed in South Korea.
But if that flies over North Korea, that's detectable, isn't it?
I think it's detectable, but it's a two-purpose, right? So one is for purpose. We should be detected.
Oh, you want it to be detected,
right? So
to sort of send a message to North Korea.
Send a message. So because the DPRK use a lot of kind of techniques to send a message for the ROK and U.S. alliance, especially during this season. If ROK and U.S. conduct the combined exercises, and then the DPRK wants to show their capability, military capabilities. So it's a one way to send our signal, military readiness. So we are watching you, don't move. Like those kind of a message can be really strong. But the other one is, as I mentioned, the intelligence community. We just try to gather all kinds of intelligence information to get a big picture. So signal definitely, image using these global Hawk or those kind of intelligence assets. And 3, human and those other civil information, maybe YouTube, those kind of all the intelligence and information get together and analyzed every day. So
with the Global Hawk, what kind of, without entering North Korean airspace, what kind of images are available of North Korea?
Actually, it's really not strange, but interesting to see civilian imaging processing companies already have kind of acquired a really quality image, not only in North Korea, but also around globe. So for example, when we look at the some situation in North Korea, I definitely look at the Google map.
I see.
So it's quite...
Okay, but that's satellite. That's not Global Hawk, though, isn't it?
No. But a satellite image is really a kind of a zoom in one kind of a spot area. So these days, as I mentioned, the commercial technology has been more advanced than the military technology. So we don't have to stick to the certain military platform to have ISR capabilities. We can use the civilian capabilities or even the U.S. DoD. I know, as far as I know, land some intelligence analysts in private company so that they can just purchase those reports from the civilian sector. So it's quite new kind of challenging, how can I say, trends.
Right. So this is the collaboration between government, so military and private enterprise.
Right.
And that leads us back to your Center for the Future Defense Technology and Entrepreneurship at Seokyeong University. Do you want to finish off this interview by telling us a little bit more about that? How many of you are there at the center? Is it big? Is it just you? Is it?
Very good question. Before answering that question, last question, I think, I just want to do some work like the as you do. So you are the really sound and then independent, some, how can I say, broadcasting and try to gather really insights and information on not only DPRK but also national security issues as well. So these are the work is really invaluable not only for the audience in the society but also the military. For me, I'm still relatively young, so I just want to help the military to advance and develop more comprehensive strategy. But it's not enough for the military itself. It needs more cooperation and understanding from outside of the military, as I mentioned, the technological advancements.
Yeah.
So I want to just play a bridging role between the civilian part and the military part in South Korea for the first step, because these two groups never can be closed because of a historical background in South Korea. So I really want to bridge those gaps. But my focus area should be more emerging threats, as I mentioned before. So yeah, that's my hope.
Okay, so the Center for Future Defense Technology and Entrepreneurship.
But how many?
Yes.
So we have 10. So it's a students, PhD student
at
MA,
Seokyeong University.
Right. Not only Seokyeong University, but also the other university. So they just came to involve some projects, or they just want to have a better understanding the defense sector. So I really get some insights from the students, and then they just learn from me about the national security or defense sector. So,
and you said that you want to be a sound and independent information and story gatherer from military and civilian sectors. Do you want to? Do you have any plans to start a podcast about the Korean military or Korean defense issues?
If I have really good skills like you to convey my thoughts, and but I'm not very good at those. So I really just try to help you or other media to better understand this issue. So that's my kind of
that's the bridging role that you see for yourself. Right. Okay. Well, I want to thank you very much for coming on the show, and good luck with doing that, fulfilling that bridging function in the future to help people better understand Korea and Korean defense issues.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Jo Dongyoun. Are you on Twitter? Is there any way that people can follow your research or work or anything?
Actually, after the president election, I just cut all the SNS, but I will just try to remake.
Okay.
Yes.
All right. So
I'll let you know later.
Let us know. We can add that to the show notes on the website. Yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, that brings us to the end of today's podcast. If you already have an NK News account, and if you're a think tank, business or academic institution, take a look at NK Pro. Our NK Pro platform offers unparalleled services specifically catering to the needs of professionals who monitor developments on the Korean Peninsula. You can inquire about access or a free trial membership by sending an email to membership@nknews.org today. Our thanks, as always, go to Arias Dare and Brian Betts for facilitating this podcast, and to our post-recording producer genius, Gabby Magnuson, all the way down in New Zealand, who cuts out the extraneous noises, awkward silences, bodily functions, etc. Thanks very much, Gabby, and thanks to everyone for listening. Check us again next time.